Chapter 42. She could not tell the difference between it and a dream before she woke. The lock popped open with a soft sound, your Etsy brushing past and kneeling for him and creeping in with a rag in hand to cover Angharaide's mouth with it. Angharade woke up looking at the ceiling, asleep and then not. It had been a glimpse, the Fisher pulling at their contract once again. The spirit had only ever done this to prevent her death, yet the noblewoman stayed lying down and looking at the ceiling as she heard the lock pop open. She should move, she thought, but could not quite bring herself to. Angharaide's mind was clear, awake, but her limbs were still dozing. It would have been easier to move the entire world than to move them. A flicker of movement, then she found your Etsy's dark eyes above and a ragged cloth was being pressed against her face. There was a scent to it, sickly sweet, and Angharade dimly realized she was being drugged. Finally that tore through the veil of somnolence and panic rose sharply in her breast. Angharade tried to rise, to fight off your Etsy, who pushed her down and cursed. 8, 9, the Easkly was counting through gritted teeth. 10, your Etsy reached, and Angharade felt a different numbness in her limbs. She tried to shout, but the sound came out slurred as if she were deep in her drinks. The Easkly holding her down eyed her warily. Another 5 seconds just in case, I think, your Etsy said. It is only spinster's milk, dear, it won't kill you. Angharade kept struggling, but it was as if her limbs had turned to lead. She could no longer feel her own jaw. Your Etsy glanced back at the door the noblewoman hadn't heard closing and Angharade's heart clenched at what she saw found there. Calm-eyed, holding a mostly shuttered lantern, Brun leaned back against the wood. She tried to say something, but between the poison and the cloth she got out only a formless moan. You told me your contract almost never breaks when used on a sleeper, the Easkly challenged. Almost, Brun indifferently replied. It could be because she has a contract herself. His hand was on his hatchet, fingering the haft in an unknowing tick. Your Etsy sighed. That's what I get for working with amateurs, she said. I need to make a sweep to see if anyone noticed us, keep an eye on her meanwhile. The fair-haired Sacramontan shrugged. His accomplice narrowed her eyes. I need to ask her questions, your Etsy said. So no accidents, Brun, or we have a problem. Understood, Brun simply said. Even as the Easkly rose and left, Angharade realized that what she had thought indifference in Brun's voice was no such thing. His tone had not once changed since he came into the room, always in the same flat near monotone. The blonde traitor came to stand by her bed, idly pushing her back down when she tried to force herself up. She was so weak, her limbs like a child's. The pair meant to kill her. They must, for they must know that otherwise she would slay them for this, but fear was slow in coming. Anger burned in its stead, like embers in the belly. Why, she tried to ask, a scream of outrage and confusion. What came out was a muted, slurred word but Brun understood her regardless. Emotion touched his face, but she thought it looked shallow. Regret only a fingernail deep. I am sorry it must be you, Brun said. You have treated me kindly and do not deserve it. But there is no one else I would get away with, and I am too close. Another flicker of emotion at the last 2 words, this one deeper than the last. Fear, Angharade saw. That was as afraid as she had ever seen the man. If I take young or sorry, Tristan will knife me in the night, Brun explained. Shalini is now being watched like a hawk and lamb. Well, she knows of me. She will have taken precautions. Already she has tried to kill me once. Angharade let out a noise of denial of the false accusation, just another traitor reaching for absolution. Brun shook his head at her. She bought spinster's milk from your Etsy, he said. I expect she put it in my waterskin, a small dose that would slowly add up, as I did not notice until that test on the toll bridge. That was. She had thought Brun seemed clumsy, when she watched him chasing the invisible spirit. But why would Lamb? It took a second for her mind to catch up to the truth he had good as admitted. You killed John, she tried to say. Josh quite June. It was nothing against her, Brun shrugged. She was closest and the twins had just fought Tristan, which I thought would muddy the waters. Sleeping God, how much had she missed? Was she struck with blindness, the only fool among a pack of wolves. It felt like she had been struck in the belly, the breath wheezing out of her. Twice Bron had killed, and now she was to be the third. And she did not even know why. Some of that must have shown on her face, for the man sighed. "I owe you for distracting the cultists during the trial of lions," Bron acknowledged. "And I suppose the knowledge won't be going anywhere." The man considered her with cold eyes. "There is a festival on the Merc," he said. "A week where lamplights are repaired, many of them taken down at once, so nowadays people hang small red paper lanterns and make small games in the streets. The trench sends miners back to the city around that time, and my mother loved making the lanterns. It was one of the few things we did together." It was, Angharad thought, horrifying to hear what sounded like such a personal story in such an utterly detached tone. "When they died, well, that is a long story," Bron said. "But I clutched to one of those paper lanterns like it was the last thing I had. Prayed to it, almost. And someone heard me." The blond man's eyes went unfocused as he glanced to the side, as if he were staring at something Angharad could not see. Bron frowned before turning his gaze back to her. "A young god," he said. "Farolito, the god of that nameless festival. I am his first contract." Bron shrugged. "He wanted to help," he said. "But gods are not men, especially when so young." He glanced to the side again, looking annoyed, then back to her. "He is being visited by his god." "I would have died if not for the pact," Bron clarified. But he did not realize what he was asking, nor I what I was giving. "I wanted to hide, for the vultures to leave me alone, and so he let me press calm into others. Empty them of everything, like the moment after the end of a festival. To do this I must be able to feel their presence, so I could." So that was the truth of the strange lethargy that had taken her. And of how he had been able to feel their pursuers during the trial of lions and the flight to Kentika. In exchange, Bron tonelessly continued, he took what he loves of the festival, emotions. Not the entire length of them, only the strong parts, and I thought it a bargain. I would never fear again, never weep in the dark. He paused. I was wrong. The simple, matter-of-fact way he spoke those 3 words sent a shiver down her spine. "It feels worse when I use my contract," Bron said. "As if all of Vesper is growing quieter, every noise falling away. And the noise, it does not return." I began to forget what it felt like to feel anything at all, and could not even muster fear that one day I would simply lay down and not care as I starved. The blond man clicked his tongue, hand swatting away at something only he could see. "He is not an evil god," Bron dutifully told her. "He meant no harm." And we found a loophole together. I could no longer feel my own emotions, but I could still feel his. And with dawning horror Angharad began to understand where the tale was heading. "We tried many things, we did," the man said. "Did you know, Lady Angharad, that in the moment a man, one not owned by the gloam, not dimmed, dies, their presence in the ether is searingly bright? All the colors and emotions of their weave, they're then gone." He raised his hand and snapped his fingers, the sound a sharp contrast to the serene face. "There is nothing Farolito loves even 100th as much as a death save for the festival, and that is only once a year," Bron said. "So I did what I must." It never ceased to astonish Angharad what manner of ugliness could fit under the mask of "I did what I must," as if behind that excuse lay an endless pit dog for horror's sake. The blond man cocked his head to the side. "I rationed it, used the pact only when I must," the Sacramontan said. "Every 6 months, more or less. It was still dangerous and I decided the watch might be able to help, to fix it. I chose the Dominion as my way and so they cannot refuse me when they find out what I do." That was, her uncle had told her, the virtue of these trials, that to pass them so you enrolled directly into the ranks of the watch. Bron sighed. "But I have had to use my contract so very much," he said, sounding faintly irritated. "To find enemies, to grasp who was lying to me or trying to get me killed." And so the world grew quiet. The blond man met her eyes. "Jen was to tide me over so I would last the rest of the journey with the Infanzones," Bron said. "Ains was because it was starting to grow difficult feigning emotion. His gaze was unblinking. I used my pack too much when we ran from cultists on the way to Kentika, the Sacramontan said. Making sure Song was not leading us into an ambush. At this rate, I might have to kill a Blastcloak in 3 Pines. Accepting your Etsy's offer was the least risky. The door opened and Brun reached for his hatchet, but Angharad's half-formed hopes were dashed. It was only your Etsy returning. The Eastly carefully closed the door behind her. No lights under the doors, she told Brun. More interestingly, Tristan is no longer in his room, and neither is Augusto Cherton. It seems we are not the only ones cleaning up before the vote. I told you, my dear, that boy is most definitely a hired killer. He is a rat to the bone, the man said. You mistake him. How has he convinced so many people of that? Your Etsy complained. After Lan traded me his suspicions for the milk, I knew the little bastard was too dangerous to leave sniffing around, but no one would bite. The best I could manage was to send Ferranda after Isabel in the hope she stumbled into whatever they've been doing about the Cherton. 13 heavens, my darlings, that boy has gone around half the trials lugging around the exact same poison box watch assassins use. How has no one outed him for it yet? Your Etsy turned to smile at her, like they were friends sharing a confidence, and Angharad felt like ripping out her teeth. Death was crawling closer to her with every word, and she kept waiting for the fear to come, but the warmth of anger yet kept it out. Like keeping your hand so close to candle flame it began to burn, chasing out every other sensation. He must be fresh to the profession, your Etsy told her. As a rule you should bring only the substances you intend to use, it is much less obvious. Brun shifted on his feet. You made your sweep, he said. Let us finish it. Soon, your Etsy said. I told you, I need her to answer some questions first. The Eastly idly unsheathed a knife, then knelt by Angharad's side. She tried to get up, but her limbs had grown so feeble they did not even need to push her back down. The point of the steel was drawn across her cheek and came to rest under her eye, lightly enough it did not cut skin. The tiles in the kitchen of Lun Hall, your Etsy said. What color are they? Angharad clenched her jaw as much as she could, which still had her tongue lolling in her mouth. Your Etsy eyed her, then sighed. Torture is very messy, dear, I do hope you won't force me to resort to it, the Eastly said. Let us try again with something easier, then. Your Uncle Ocean, where is he getting all the coin? Did your mother perhaps bury a fortune somewhere? Tell him of the location? Angharad blinked. What coin? Your Etsy's eyes narrowed impatiently. The man has been spending gold like it is copper, my dear, the Eastly said. He put out an open contract matching whatever price is on your head for the skull of any assassin trying to take yours, and he's known to have paid out at least 10 times. I heard so many assassins slew each other trying to catch you in Ixta that the guilds in the city are still at war. Angharad choked. Ixta? The sleepy little port town on the Emerald Coast where she had spent exactly 3 hours waiting on the docks before changing ships? Your Etsy let out an irritated sound. Useless, she said. Do you know why he pulled the open contract, at least? Did he run out of coin? It happened when you arrived in Sacramonte, and I know you received at least one letter from him there. Angharad leaned forward, as if to give answer, and your Etsy came closer. Only when she tried to spit on the other woman her tongue would not move, so only specks of spittle flew and the rest stayed bubbling on her lips. Your Etsy withdrew with a sigh. Ianto was not nearly this much trouble, she complained. So eager to talk, that girl, she gave me everything I needed the first day. It must have been her contract that got her recommended for the Cryptia, because she did not notice in the slightest when I doused her water skin with milk. Not much, just enough to slow her down some. The same dose I traded Lan. Your Etsy shrugged. After that it was just a question of waiting for her to stumble and be caught by those red-eye savages. Looking at the smug pride on the Eastly's face, Angharad felt genuine hate for one of the few times in her life as she remembered the bleak grief on Zenzel's face. How broken must you be, to make a living out of inflicting suffering? Don't be jealous, dear, your Etsy chided. House Sandal offered a tidy sum for the death of the little bitch who stole the husband of their matriarch's favorite niece, but it's not even half of what is on offer for you. I just decided to collect on the girl first after seeing you go up against that saint. It seemed likely you would pick up wounds-saving fools anyhow. Your Etsy wagged a finger. Only you kept surviving, you inconvenient darling you, and even when I got close you kept living through my attempts, she said. I tried to off you discreetly during the trial with the clockwork god and then again in the stairs with Ice Han, but you are a most difficult creature to kill. Foo you, Angharade snarled. I don't tell you this to boast, my dear, your Etsy patiently said. I tell you so might understand that I am not some hired thug but a professional, an anointed daughter of the Obsidian Society under broker contract. It is our rule that learning knowledge which only the mark would know serves a proof of the kill, but when that is not feasible one may also present the head instead. She leaned forward. Tell me the color of the kitchen tiles in Land Hall, your Etsy said, and your uncle will receive a corpse with a head still on it. I understand Mulaney have some funerary customs relating to eyes, no? Would you not prefer to ease his grief while you still can? I Ashmnoth, Angharade bit out, Mulaney. And she would not help this creature to get away more cleanly with her crimes. Perhaps she could not fight, but she could at least try to make enough of a mess that these animals were caught. Song would see to it. The Silverite Tianxi would not let this go, the sole comfort Angharade had in this ugly mess. She tried to rise again and found some sliver of strength yet remained to her limbs. Your Etsy clicked her tongue in disappointment. Fine, she said, sheathing her knife. It was always a long shot, and it's not like torture is reliable when one cannot take their time. Brun, try not to make too much a mess. I'll hold her down for you. Angharade half raised her arm, but she was brushed aside like a child and pushed back into the mattress by a bored your Etsy. That boredom somehow insulted her more than the rest of this put together. That she was a chore, not even a foe. Brun, face twisting with something like relief, approached with his hatchet in hand. Angharade met his eyes, burning with indignation, and the blond man stilled for a moment. His green eyes flicked to your Etsy, almost considering, but then he sighed. The hatchet rose all the way. Death came down for her as a sharp length of steel, only to slow. A whisper sounded in her ears, rising to become the nearing beat of wings until it blotted out everything else and a strange power rippled through her body. Above her a single, beautiful peafowl feather drifted down from the ceiling and Angharade realized that her limbs no longer felt numb. The Mayor is a blessing, it had cleared the poison. The spirit's power left her, the hatchet coming down viper swift again, but Angharade was no longer helpless. She grabbed your Etsy by the collar, dragging her in the way, and took vicious satisfaction the way the Easkli's eyes widened in utter surprise. Fuck, the assassin cursed, the blow taking her in the shoulder with a wet thump. Angharade kneed her in the stomach, your Etsy stumbling back with a wheeze, and as she rose pushed the stumbling Easkli into a surprised Brun. The back of his knees hit the bedside table, tipping her sheathed saber to the ground, and she caught it with the tip of her toes. Assassins, she shouted, only halfway through realizing there was no use. The door was closed and the owners of the two nearest rooms were in front of her. Brun yanked his hatchet out of your Etsy's back, earning a hoarse scream, and as he turned to hack at her Angharade deftly threw up her saber with her toes. She caught the scabbard just as his blow came down, slapping aside his forearm with it so the hatchet went by her shoulder. Your Etsy struck from the other side, knife back in hand, but Angharade halfway unsheathed her saber to strike her chin with the pommel of the sword and knock her back. She glimpsed. Brun hacked at her back, biting into her spine and sending her slash. And turned with a blow she would not have seen, getting out of the way just in time for the hatchet to take your Etsy in the arm as she turned around Brun's back and finished unsheathing the blade. She kept the scabbard in hand. Her knees almost buckled as a wave of apathy hammered into her mind, but elbowing Brun in the back at the sensation vanishing into smoke. She finished turning around to face them. Brun was a skilled fighter, she thought, but it was a raw sort of talent. He had not been taught that being predictable in a duel was death. The Sacramontan pushed away from her to make distance, so that he might have enough room to swing his hatchet, but Angharad had begun swinging even as she turned. The edge of the saber caught him at temple height in a slight angle, splitting his eye like an egg and sinking into the skull. Death in a stroke. Angharad calmly kicked his back as she ripped free the blade, brain spraying as it sent the corpse falling into your Etsy's way and forced the Iski to draw back nearer to the door. The assassin licked her lips, Angharad watching as it sunk in for the other woman that she was 2 wounds in and standing alone. You took an oath, the Iski suddenly said. Not to do violence on other trial takers. If I no longer fight you, you cannot. Angharad threw the scabbard at her face. The knife went up to slap it aside, and that was all it took. The point of her saber went straight into your Etsy's heart, pinning her to the door with a thump as the assassin let out a wet gurgle. You knowingly broke the rules of the trial of weeds, assassin, Angharad politely informed her. You no longer qualify as a trial taker. She broadened her stance, preparing to rip out the blade, but before she could the door burst open and the corpse flew at her. Smothering a sound of surprise, Angharad struggled to hold on to her saber as someone forced their way into the room, only to find Song leveling a musket at her, Sarai right behind her and sloppily pointing a pistol as she held up a lantern. Yo, Song said, taken aback. There was a heartbeat of silence. Are we quite sure, Sarai began, eyes lingering on the 2 cooling corpses, that she was the one needing rescuing here? Angharad's jaw locked. The Mayor's blessing saved my life, she stiffly said. They came with me with a poison and bronze contract. Her stare firmed as she turned to Song after saying thus. A jest, Sarai said. I meant no offense. Angharad did not reply, eyes staying on Song and silently asking why she had not warned anyone of Brun's contract. It would have been a much stronger suspect than Ice Hans, and while she could understand wanting to keep the power of her own eyes quiet, that did not excuse warning no one at all. I do not know what it does, Song admitted. Did, now, I suppose. It was written in some sort of Sacramentan street jargon, half the words weren't even recognizably Antigua. The noblewoman gave a slow nod and felt a knot in her shoulders loosen. Had Song been one of the pack of selfish schemers she was being forced to deal with, she was not sure what she would have done. So much of what she had taken to be truth before coming to this island was nobles acting like wolves, loyalty a hangman's noose and honor in the strangest of places. She had thought Peretta the model of the world, once, but now she was forced to wonder how much she might have missed. Angharad swallowed, mind was still a whirl with all her killers had said. Your Etsy was a confessed liar, so much of what she said about others could be discounted, but her talk of Tristan, and that he had been accomplice to Isabel, who she knew did have troubles with the Sheridan brothers, rang uncomfortably true. Raymond had disappeared after spending time alone with him, for which they had yet to receive account. No one had thought to take that up since both men were expected dead, but perhaps there was a need after all. Angharad felt a great exhaustion settle on her shoulders like a mantle, and with it a vicious urge, to out every dirty little secret this misbegotten island carried, to finally have it out and done. Sarai cleared her throat. We should wake everyone else, have it known now the pair tried to kill you, the pale-skinned woman said. Else accusations might turn ugly come morning. There is more to tell besides, Angharad wearily said. Brun effectively confessed to the murders of both John and Ains, while your Etsy admitted to being a member of something called the Obsidian Society, as well to poisoning Ianda with something called spinster's milk. Sarai let out a noise of surprise. Zenzel won't take that well, she warned. He must be told regardless, Angharad replied. Though first, she decided, she should drag the corpses out into the hall. The blood was soaking her floor. Wiping her blade on your Etsy's back, Angharad went to pick up her scabbard and sheathed it. She was about to go looking for her boots when someone turned the corner. Shalini, looking haggard but with both pistols up, stumbled into the scene and froze. A heartbeat later Firanda followed, blade in hand, and then Zenzel half-tripped past them as he pulled on his boots. Huh? Firanda said. The Someshwari lowered her pistols. Shalini's eyes flicked back and forth between them and the dead. What happened? She asked. They attempted to kill Angharad in the night, Song told them. It went poorly. No shit, Shalini immussedly said. I could have told them how that'd go if they'd asked. And the other two of you? Zenzel asked with a frown, finally dragging his boot up. A pause. Angharad turned to the other two women, cocking an eyebrow. What had drawn them to her room? She had thought the sound would not carry. Sarai sighed. At Song's request, I put a sign on Lady Angharad's door that would break if someone opened it, she said. They had me at their mercy for quite some time, Angharad neutrally said. She appreciated the gesture, but not the presumption. Besides, why her of all people? I slept through it breaking, Sarai admitted, sounding embarrassed. She reddened under the number of incredulous looks thrown her way. Look, it's not a sign I have fully mastered and I haven't had a good night's sleep in days, she said. I ended up waking up later and noticing it was gone, so I went to get Song and we found. Predictable consequences? Zenzel drily finished. Whatever else might have been said, it was forced to wait. More were joining them, the rising sound of talk in the hall drawing them. Tupac first, who made a point of theatrically gasping as the sight of the bodies, then Len and Kozm. Angharad faced them, face still flecked with blood. Let me get dressed, she sighed, and then I will tell you everything. It was not long to explain, for all that it had felt an eternity when the pair had her prisoner. Zenzel's face went bloodless when he was told his beloved had been drugged into demise at the behest of House Sandil, Shalini laying a hand on his arm, while Tupac looked slightly miffed. Remembering your Etsy's confession regarding the stairs, Angharad made her amends there. I did not believe you when you claimed Ishan was pushed by her, the noblewoman said, addressing Shalini. Yet she did, and I apologize for my mistrust. The other woman grimaced. We looked pretty shady at the time, she replied. Water under the bridge. As for Firanda, Angharad was too tired to keep secrets any longer. Song and I found a secret passage in the gate shrine and overheard your conversation with Isabel when you accused her, she bluntly said. Your Etsy has since confessed that she directed you after Isabel in the hopes that you would stumble into some alleged plot against the Cheridans she was weaving with Tristan. Firanda Vilazar drew back in surprise. Are you sure? Tristan? I am certain she said it, Angharad said. She also confessed herself a murderer and a liar, so I put little stock in her words. The gray-eyed man was a criminal of some sort, and prone to tricks, but he had also demonstrated a certain sense of honor. Several times he had risked his life on behalf of others to no clear gain. The boy is suspicious, Kozm grunted. He came back and Remen did not. He came back with a belly wound from falling down that slide with your Cheridan, Sarai flatly replied. Had to be treated for lockjaw, you can ask the Blastcloaks. Your boy Remen wasn't quite so lucky and he's still impaled somewhere in the maze as far as we know. Nasty way to go. She did not sound all that sympathetic. Where is he right now, then? The mustachioed man pressed. Young cannot leave his room, but where is the rat? Investigating the activities of the townsfolk, as I requested of him, Song flatly said. I find it somewhat interesting you do not ask where Augusto is, as he is also missing. Kozm straightened. Augusto is no longer my responsibility, but Remond was. Nobody cares about your brats, Kozm, Lan interrupted, tone impatient. Tristan could have slit both their throats in the middle of the street and most of us would have clapped. Tredegar, get on with it. What about Brun? Kozm Floor looked more than a little angry, but he had no friends in the hall. Angharad laid out the rest of what your Etsy had told her, prompting an interested noise from Tupac at the mention of the Obsidian Society. They are famous assassins in Eastleigh, he informed them all in a rare display of concord. They are a cult of the skeletal butterfly that takes killing contracts. They've been around for centuries. Rumor has it they even slew a grasshopper king once. She moved on to Brun, after that, and revulsion rose as she described this contract and how it had slowly turned him into a murderer. The description of its effect said Shalini grimacing. I felt something like that on the night John was killed, she admitted. When I had the watch. I thought I was just tired and never entirely fell asleep, so I said nothing save to Ishan, but everything Lady Angharad speaks of is something I had felt. Lan looked murderous, an unusual look on her face, but then what did Angharad know? Both Yuretsi and Baran had accused her of poisoning him before the toll road, something the Perdiri had mentioned and the blue-lipped woman not denied. Angharad had thought herself aware of most the undercurrents in their company, wise to its workings even if she occasionally missed pieces, but that illusion had just been most thoroughly stripped away. Others had danced around her so deftly she never even noticed she was attending a ball. No more of that, Angharad coldly thought. She would not be made such a fool again. Tupac, who was closest to the stairs, suddenly tensed. He raised a hand at the rest of them, demanding silence as he raised his spear. "Someone just came in," he whispered. Lord Zenzel glanced at their group, then down below. "It is Tristan," he said. He had used this contract, she thought. Tristan must have a tie to someone in here. Tupac did not put the spear down. "Sickle," Angharad warningly said, hand going to her blade. 3 in a night would just be greedy, Tredegar, Tupac chided her immussedly. He put the weapon down, however, just as someone began hurrying up the stairs. The loudness of it was startled her. Tristan was a light-footed man, yet now he stumped up at a run. The scruffy gray-eyed man erupted past the threshold, steps stuttering when he saw them all gathered in the hall. "Oh," Tristan said. "Everyone is here. Good." His eyes flicked to the corpses, unmoved at the sight. He did not even ask. "Finally showing up, are you?" Tupac drawled. "Lateness is becoming a habit with you." "Tupac, shut the fuck up," the man said, and there was a ripple of surprise at that unusual boldness. "We do not have time for this. I was just in the town square, where our house, every single one of which is a devil, were having a spirited conversation about eating us all." The silence was instant and complete. "Then on my way back," Tristan ferociously continued, "I passed by the postern gate where I happened to catch Augusto Cherdan letting in a war band of cultists. This happened." He produced a small timepiece, popping open the lid to see. It felt vaguely familiar. 3 minutes and change ago, he finished. "By now I expect they will be moving to free the slaves." Noise erupted all at once, half a dozen people speaking up. Sung's voice cut through, clear and calm. Trained, Angharad thought. Sung Ren had been trained for command, or at least leadership. "Dress and arm yourselves," she said. "Everything else can wait." Some grumbling, but Angharad cut through it by hurrying to her own room and picking up her bag. Enough followed suit at the sight of her that the rest were pressured into doing the same. It had been a mostly symbolic gesture on her part, as her affairs were already packed, and she was back within moments. Just in time to hear a song and Sare interrogating Tristan. 1 was older than the others, called Akados, and some of the other devils accused him of wanting to anneal through slaughter, the man said. "I have no real notion of what that might mean. Older devils eventually become fixed shapes in the ether," Sung absent-mindedly replied. "Their kind calls that process annealing, like the smithing term." She would know, the Perdiri thought. The republics allowed devils citizenship, sometimes even to serve as bureaucrats. "What does it mean, a fixed shape in the ether?" Angharad asked, stepping close. What she said, Tristan supported. She fought down the flicker of fondness. His eyes had not wavered at the sight of the corpse, and too many black rumors yet hung over his head. Angharad was done putting trust in smiling strangers. "It means no matter how many times you kill them they'll crawl back out of the ether eventually," Sare grimaced. "Old devils are nothing to trifle with, though this one should yet fall short of the threshold. If it is old enough to be discerning about the kind of ether it feeds on, it must be getting close," Sung warned. "I expect if it fed on the simpler etheric taint of murder rather than slaughter it might have finished the process." Angharad cocked her head to the side. "Is this discernment why devils in stories are afflicted with strange compulsions?" she asked. Children's tales had clever heroes outsmarting them by spilling beads the devils then had to count, tricking them into suicide for being unable to find a rhyme for their sentence. "More or less," Sung said. "But that conversation can wait until we are in a place of safety. Tristan, you have your affairs. Everything I care to carry, the gray-eyed man said, then paused. He turned to Sarah. Young? She grimaced. He cannot stand, she replied. Then we will have to carry him, Tristan flatly replied. Lady Angharade, if I might ask for your help? A worthy cause, Angharade thought, and so she nodded her head. She was the one who knocked, a muted voice telling her to enter. Young was lying in his bed, half naked but his torso so thoroughly covered by bandages he might as well have been wearing a shirt. Only his arms and part of his shoulders were left bare, the expanse of skin drawing attention to the loaded pistol he was pointing their way. The barrel wobbled when he began coughing wetly, and his eyes were watery. He recognized them after a moment, lowering the pistol and setting it on the bedside table. What happened? He croaked. I heard voices. Bronnier Etsy tried to offer, Tristan bluntly said, jutting a thumb Angharade's way. She killed them instead, I hear, and outed all their dirty little secrets. Angharade eyed him, reluctantly amused. Tristan went to spy on the townsfolk and found out they are all devils, she contributed. Augusto Cherton, the Arnorlas cur, has also led in a war band of cultists. The timepiece snapped open, then closed. Angharade could not shake the feeling that she had seen it somewhere before. About 5 minutes ago, Tristan said. We need to get moving or we'll be hip-deep in devils and darklings soon. Young let out a rattling breath. My stitches won't hold, he said. I cannot move. That is why we came to carry you, Angharade said. You mishear me, Young said. It is not that I cannot walk, I cannot move. The physician told me I am to stay abed for at least 2 weeks. That physician was a devil who wanted to eat you, Tristan pointed out, quite reasonably in your opinion. I saw the stitches in a mirror, the older man replied. They cover much of my back, and if they rip there is no question that I will die. I do not dismiss your concerns, Angharade assured him. We will ask for the help of others and take great care. But we must move, Young. She's right, Tristan quietly said. The devils will come here for certain, it's where the meal is. Young stared at them for a long moment, then breathed out. I know, he finally said. I know. And it would be an ugly way to die. He clenched his fingers. I expect I won't be able to move much, Young said. I may have to trouble you to carry word for me, Tristan. The younger man stilled, face closing like a shutter. Your husband? Angharade frowned, for the Sacramontan sounded like he hoped he was wrong. Young nodded. After a grimace, Tristan nodded back. She could not help but feel as if she were intruding, somehow. The Tiangxi's stare moved on to her. I require some privacy, he told her. I understand it is unpleasant, but you will need help to dress, she said, trying to be delicate. Some matters require privacy, he gently replied, eyes flicking to the chamber pot. Ah, Angharade thought with some embarrassment. Indeed she would prefer not to be there for that. Young, Tristan began, but the veteran raised a hand. Don't, he said. We have said all we need to say. Nothing has changed. The gray-eyed man looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he let out a long breath. I guess it hasn't, Tristan said, voice soft. He sharply nodded, then walked away. Angharade followed him out, carefully closing the door behind her. Tristan leaned against the wall, folding his arms, and the frown that had never quite left deepened at the sight of how grim he looked. How his jaw was clenched. He lied, she said. She had suspected as much, but now knew. A shot sounded from behind the door. Tristan flinched. He chose to make it quick, the man hoarsely said, instead of ripping his stitches and suffering hours of agony before the same end. It was. Tristan licked his lips. It was his choice to make. He sounded, Angharade thought, like a man who was not sure who he was trying to convince. She should have been angry at being deceived again, but Angharade could not muster it when she saw the grief and cast of face. Tristan pushed off the wall, a slight tremble to his hand. If you'll excuse me, he got out, I need to make sure my friend died with the first shot. For he had not, Angharade realized with faint horror, Tristan would have to finish the job himself. She watched him open the door, glimpsed the billow of powder smoke and red on the wall, then looked away. She kept her eyes on the stairs as she heard him say to his dead friend, fighting not to throw up. No one asked what had happened to young. Seeing Tristan lay his body to rest on the bed was enough to quell the urge in even the most curious among them. Angharaide's gaze swept through their company, finding them assembled and as ready as they would get. She swallowed, gaze still shying away from the room where a man had taken his own life. "We are to proceed, then," she said. "Song has shown all of you the map, so all should know where we are together, half a mile north of here, by the marked stones." "It has all been said before," Lord Zenzel mildly said. "Shall we?" She threw him an irritated glance but nodded. Yet before she could take a single step down the stairs, a metallic sound drew her eye, and that of most present. Tristan had gone back into Young's room and tipped a lantern. Oil spilled over the corpse of the veteran, spreading a tide of softly lapping flame. "I am not leaving him for the devils to eat," the gray-eyed man evenly said. "Besides, it can serve as a distraction for our escape." Several looked like they wanted to argue, but the oil was quite literally already spilled and now the bedding was catching aflame. There was no time to waste, not that they had been rich in minutes before. "Hurry," Angharade said, cutting through the silence. "If they do not yet know we are onto them, they soon will." She moved down the stairs, knowing that action would cut through any urge to argue. No one wanted to debate with a departing back. She heard steps follow behind, adjusting her scabbard on her hip so it would not hit the wall, and in moments she'd reached the common room. There her steps stuttered, for she found she was not alone. Angharade moved out of the way so the man behind her, Tupac, could follow, but her eyes never left the man she was facing. Only Mayor Crespin was not truly a man, was he? The devil wearing the corpse of a bearded, middle-aged man was waiting by the exit, flanked on both sides by two closed shutters. He leaned against the door, square in their way should they want to leave. "I hear fire," the devil said. "We hear of plots," Angharade replied, the others coming down behind her. Lantern light ate away at the shadows of the room, muskets rising and blades leaving scabbards. The mayor seemed unmoved by their numbers. "'Tis a poor notion," Crespin said, tone dipping in a formal, almost antiquated Antigua. Yet my kin agreed, so it must be done. In the distance, she heard shots. The mayor twitched. As he should, if the cultist war band was loose in town and gathering their slaves against them. "You have greater worries than we, I think," Angharade said. "Can you truly afford this distraction?" The devil seemed amused. "Why should I worry of a scapegoat skipping all the way to the altar?" he asked. "It was not us that killed him, so, good lass cloaks, but errant cultists of the eye." Her jaw clenched at the mockery. "It need not come to violence," she tried one last time. "You're loosens," Crespin told her, not unkindly. "No thing done to you may be named violence. There was no bargain to be had here, not with a creature such as this." "Walk away," Angharade said, slowly unsheathing her blade. "While you still can." Mayor Crespin twitched, lifeless eyes looking her up and down, not with a lover's appraisal but a butcher's, tracing the cuts in the meat. "Alive, if you can," the devil ordered. The shutters exploded into wooden shards, devils bursting through them. Shots sounded from behind Angharade, billowing plumes of smoke as her allies fired their guns, and one of the silhouettes was swatted down, but rose a heartbeat later, half of its face missing and revealing cracked chitin. Crespin was still leaning against the door, having merely cocked his head an inch to the side to avoid a bullet. "Focus fire on the wounded one," Song called out from behind her, voice completely calm. "Crack the carapace." Leaving tactics in good hands, Angharade strode out to meet the enemy with allies at her side, Tupac on one side, Zenzel the other. A dark-haired woman with a tanned, weathered face leapt at her like an animal. It was a startling jump, impossible with human legs, but momentum was a universal shackle. Angharade slid under the leaping form, letting her pass by, and then pivoted cleanly to open her from shoulder to spine. Skin parted like parchment, but under it some kind of oily chitinous carapace refused to give under her blade. She left a long scar and the devil screamed, but she was turning around furiously within a heartbeat. Painful, then, but not a wound. Angharad caught a glimpse of Tupac impaling a devil through the stomach, nailing the false man to the floor, and of Zenzel struggling with a bald old man. Rapid fire from the back still nailing the fourth attacker to the ground. Crespin watched all, indifferent. She had no more attention to spare. Her devil let out a furious clicking screech, skin rippling as it struck at her. A simple slap that would have hit her shoulder, and though quick it was predictable. Angharad caught it with her blade angled to go through the wrist, her training moving before her mind, only instead of cutting off the hand she almost lost her blade. Even that slight, awkward blow had been like getting kicked. Lips thinning, Angharad drew back her blade, scarring Carapace again, and glimpsed. Slash skin rippled, a leg ripping its way out and piercing her throat. Slash. In time to half-step out of the way of the jutting, thin limb that lanced out of the devil's back. Angharad aimed her swing carefully, and finally the blade bit through. Steel ripped through the horrid appendage, dropping it as the devil screeched and scuttled back. The severed leg twitched on the floor, bloodless and seemingly boiling. The sight of it inspired a deep, visceral disgust in her. Her devil foe was twitching uncontrollably under the shell, two more legs ripping their way out as it skittered away in fear of her. Tupac's own opponent lay on the ground, convulsing. Sleeping God, what was that segmented spear made of? And the Eascli was giving a bloodied Zenzel a hand, driving back his own as the firing line pinned the fourth to the wall with shots and burst its belly open into a spurt of disgusting pale flesh. They were winning, she thought, but one of their foes had yet to take the field. Pathetic, Mayor Crespin said. Useless castings one and all, a waste of his infernal majesty's grace. Stathra, her devil whined, they are. Crespin moved, fast enough she saw but a blur, and then he was holding the wounded devil by the throat. Without batting an eye, he tossed his comrade at the firing line. Angharad let out a cry of warning. She heard Cosm draw his sword, cursing, and a glimpse of Tristan fumbling with a pistol she had last seen in Young's hand. The distraction cost her, for in that heartbeat Crespin casually grabbed the table and smashed it down on her. Angharad brought up her hands to shield her head and was hammered into the ground, dazed. The wood splintered atop her. Hissing in pain she kicked off the piece pinning her down, rolling out of the way just in time to see Crespin ram his way through the counter and rip out a long and sharp piece. His eyes turned further away, where the tossed devil was fighting the others in a messy sprawl, and Angharad saw what he was looking at, the lanterns. Devils saw in the dark. Humans did not. Without the lanterns, they were all dead. With a cry she threw herself forward, hacking wildly at his arm, and the devil turned at her with an irritated look. A slap caught her in the belly, near cracking a rib and sending her tumbling away on the floor. She stopped only when her shoulder hit the wall, just under one of the windows. Through which, she saw with surprise, a musket was being aimed. Angharad had just long enough to drop her sword and cover her ears so she would not go deaf from the shot. A dozen muskets unloaded into common room, the cult of the Red Eye announcing their entry into the fight. Snarling, Angharad reached out through the window and dragged the man through it by his collar, wincing at the tenderness of her ribs, to smash his face into the floor. The hollow flailed, shouting, and as she rose she snatched her blade back even as her booted heel came down on the man's neck to snap it. Someone tossed a javelin her way and she narrowly ducked behind the still-closed door. Two cultists leapt inside the inn through the windows, but a heartbeat later Mayor Crespin darted out of the smoke to rip one's jaw out, nonchalantly gobbling down the flesh and bone as the cultists screamed. The older devil was driven away by musket shots, but he would be back. More cultists leapt in, swords high as they ran into the smoke. There was no winning this, Angharad thought, eyes trying to find the rest of her companions but finding only an anarchy of powder smoke, steel and hateful blows. She opened her mouth, thinking to call for a retreat, but her words were drowned out. A chunk of the ceiling dropped, revealing a burning inferno above as smoke swept out. The fire Tristan had set earlier, she recalled as she pushed down a hysterical swell of laughter. To the door with me, she shouted over the roar of the flames. Through the swirling smoke she saw silhouettes moving, some of them running towards her, others fighting. Feranda leapt over a burst of spreading flames, Lan hurrying behind her, and for a moment Angharad thought she saw Cosm headed her way as well. Only another chunk of ceiling fell in the way, the man drawing back with a shout, and he was dragged away by Tristan. Song was at her side a moment later, bleeding from the arm. A chunk of it had been ripped out. "We need to go," the Tiangsi shouted over the din. Crespin broke a wall, the others have a way out. Angharad risked one last glance back, seeing a silhouette crossing the smoke. Short, coughing her lungs out. She brushed off Song's hand on her shoulder, hurrying back to help Shalini out of the smoke as the Someshwari held on to her side. "Open it," she shouted at Feranda. The Infan's owner ripped open the door and Song ran through first, pivoting within moments and shooting at someone they could not see. They followed in the Tiangsi's wake, finding a dead cultist slumping against the wall with his musket on the floor as the rest hesitated, split between the devils inside and the fleeing company. A bestial scream coming from inside burning wreck of the last rest was what settled the matter. One of the cultists spitefully threw a javelin their way, but the others turned their muskets towards the devils as the 5 of them fled into the streets. There was little safety to be found out here, for chaos had seized the town. Houses all over Kentika had been set aflame, and as they roared high slaves fled into the brutal melee between the cultists and the devils. Not all slaves were running for safety, however, many instead taking whatever lay around as weapons and joining the Red Eye cult in fighting the devils, some of which had lost patience and ripped their way clear of their shell, moving through the smoke like ghosts and ripping apart men as muskets sounded and spears bit into chitin. "Manes," Lan breathed out, "it's a full-on uprising. We need to get out of here." "Stay close," Angharad called out. "We head for the front gate." Of their party, only the Tiangsi twin was not a fighter. The rest of them clustered around her, Angharad and Feranda in front, Shalini and Sung behind. They ran 2 blocks down before someone took notice of them, a cultist shouting and pointing their way to draw the attention of the mob of escaped slaves around him. A heartbeat later Sung put a shot between his eyes, which had half the slaves scattering as his body dropped. They ran away before the other half, visibly enraged, could catch them. They turned a corner through a veil of smoke, following the curve of the palisade towards what should be the front gate. Twice more they ran into hollows, but the first time they were fleeing slaves who gave their company a wide berth, and the second lot, 3 spearmen in mail, were chased off by a few shots. They were lucky, Angharad realized. The front gate was far from the fighting. The worst of it was deep in Kentika, where hollows had been kept imprisoned and the cultists now fought the devils. Soon they were standing by the gates, which were yet closed. A wooden gatehouse by their side should carry the wheel that would open the gate, so the 5 of them carefully moved towards the simple wooden house nestled to the right of the gate. There was not a soul in sight, and barely any light. Theirs came from the lantern Lan had lit and the inferno rising in the distance. The older Tiangsi took the lead. "Unlocked," the blue-lipped woman said, testing the gatehouse's handle. She pushed it open, stepping into the dark with her lantern high, and in that same breath she was grabbed. Angharad let out a shout of alarm, rushing forward through the doorway, but there was a flash as a musket was fired and Shalini only narrowly dragged her out of the way as a bullet whizzed right past her shoulder. Between the shot and Lan's toppled lantern she caught a glimpse of what lay inside, at least 3 cultists with swords and muskets, pointing them at the door. "See? I told you they would go for the gate, like rats leaving a sinking ship." Fury rose, bursting out as a snarl as she ripped her way out of Shalini's grasp and recognized that voice. "Augusto," she hissed. She could not see him, he was hiding out of sight, but by where the voice came from he must be the one who had taken Lan. "I have a knife at your pet's throat, you Malani bitch," Augusto replied. "And enough men with me you have no hope of forcing your way through." Angharad glanced at Shalini, silently asking whether her contract would make a lie of that, but the short Someshwari grimaced and shook her head. However fast her hand, it was not faster than a finger already on the trigger. "You have nothing to win by this," Angharad snarled. "And know that if you kill Lan, I will personally torch that gatehouse with you inside it." The choke point of the door worked both ways. Their muskets would keep his band in just as theirs would keep her company out. The Cheriton chuckled. He did this for leverage, Sung quietly said, lowering her voice so the men in the gatehouse could not hear. He wants something from us. Oh, he'll kill us if he can, Ferander just as quietly said. That was no warning shot. But I wager our red-eye friends did not trust him with nearly as men as he would have liked, so he came ready to bargain. How much is that rot's life worth to you, Tredegar? Augusto called out. I happen to be in the mood to trade. Lan was under her protection, Angharad thought with a clenched jaw. She felt Song's eyes on her, saw the objection that lay there, and ignored it. She would have no truck with expediency. What do you want, Cheriton? She asked. An oath from all of you, he said, and her brow rose. You are to tell the watch that you killed me, and if one of you breaks that oath you are to kill them for it. She frowned. Why would he need this? Angharad, unpleasant as the notion was not even entirely certain the Blastcloaks would execute him for letting in the cultists. Tupac had worked with them, and evidently felt safe on the assumption they would not. So he fears they will execute him for something else, she decided, and the answer soon came as to what that might be. You contracted with the Red Eye, she evenly said. Down in the maze. The watch will kill you for it. I am not hearing agreement, Augusto called out. A heartbeat later she heard Lan let out a cry, then struggle. Her fingers creaked around the grip of her saber, but to charge through that doorway was death. He cut me, the Tianxi said, sounding like she had a hard time keeping calm. And I will do it again, until I have what I want, the Cheriton said. The rat for the oath. I don't understand why he wants it, Shalini muttered. It won't get him off this fucking island, and it's not like the Blastcloaks will hunt him if he goes off with the cultist tribes. He does not intend to stay on this island, Ferander guessed. He would go back to Sacramonte. The watch will kill him for that contract, Sung said. Unless he intended on killing them first, they all thought. To lead an army of cultists against Three Pines and seize a ship by force, sailing back to Sacramonte without them, and they're hid behind the protection of House Cheriton. He's gone mad then, Angharad said. A single war band and whatever slaves he press gangs to take on a fortress of the watch. They will make meat of him. Then she saw it, the lay of the scheme. No, not mad. He is thinking like a warlord, she breathed out. He would use the victory here to gather other tribes to his banner, try to unite them against the watch. Even then the odds were against him, and her companions looked as skeptical as she felt. But that was why he wanted the oath, she thought. So he would have time to muster the tribes and yet still strike at Three Pines with the advantage of surprise. Perhaps he intended on feigning he was a late survivor and opening a gate as he had done here, or any other half-dozen schemes. It did not matter, Angharad thought. If he wanted the stars in a cup, then she would make that promise. I will take your oath, Angharad said. Angharad, Sung hissed. She met those silver eyes squarely. I will take that oath, she repeated, and so will everyone here. In exchange for this you will release Lan unharmed. Doubts on their faces, but she would not brook contradiction in this. Good, Augusto said. How honorable of you, Mulaney. Swear to it, and I will do the same. Angharad did, and under her quelling eyes the others did the same. Lan was sent stumbling through the doorway, bleeding shallowly from the neck. Ferander grabbed her and pulled her out of the line of fire. There was another spurt of laughter from inside the gatehouse. Shall we now bargain for us to open the gates for you? Augusto called out. Unless you want to come and try yourself. What she wanted, Angharad thought, was to take a lantern and set that gatehouse aflame. But that might break the mechanism that would let them out, and she was not sure strength alone would be enough to force open the gates. Her other choice was to pass by the heart of Kentika and try Tristan's postern gate, but that was no true choice. She was not sure exactly where it was and the path was likely to be dangerous. That in Augusto was certain to follow behind and try to rally cultists against them, now that he knew where they were. They were the entire reason the man was here, Angharad realized. He had been afraid enough of them slipping out of Kentika in the chaos that he was sitting out the battle entirely. Speak your terms, Angharad said, ignoring the rising anger of her companions. "So pliant," Augusto taunted. "You should have been like this from the start, Tredegar. I'll have another oath from you for the privilege of my tolerance." "Then speak it," she replied, losing patience. He must have heard it in her voice, for he wasted no more time. "You are to commit no violence against me nor allow your companions to do the same, or attempt to imprison me nor allow your companions to do the same," Augusto said. "Under that oath you could walk out and kill me and I would be allowed to do nothing about it," she said. "I refuse." "Fine," he snorted. "The same terms, but violence is allowed in your own defense and that of your companions." "That is a lifetime oath," she noted. "I will accept it only within the confines of Kentika." "The entire island," Augusto shot back. Angharad's eyes narrowed. He thought to play word games with the daughter of Peredur? It would cost him. "Until 24 hours have passed," she offered. A heartbeat of hesitation. "Agreed." They took the oath, and a few moments later the gates began to open. Angharad smiled, humming the first few bars of The Fair Wife, and considered the death of Augusto Certain. Chapter 43. It was a tight squeeze, but Tristan limped out into the alley. He was third out of the hole in the wall the mayor made trying to murder Tupac, an admirable undertaking, regardless of one's politics or stance on people eating, and the two that had come out ahead were as much keeping an eye on each other as the empty alley they stood in. The first, Lord Zenzel Duma, was cut of typical Milani cloth, tall, dark eyes, wide nose. Yet his cheeks were gaunt from grief and his soft noble features were gainsayed by the recent flint to his stare. He was unharmed save for a bit of soot on his clothes. In contrast Tupac Sickle, though as eerily perfect as usual, had suffered from the fight. Ironically not from the devils, two of which he had slain with whoops of joy, but from the volley the cultists had unloaded blindly into the last rest. He'd been shot twice, one bullet in his right shoulder near the edge of his breastplate and the other in the opposite thigh. Either should have knocked the man out of the fight, but Tristan could see that the shoulder shot, from which Tupac had casually ripped out the bullet, already looked like it was mending. Not as quickly as it allegedly had in other circumstances, though. Was it because he had 2 wounds this time? Can the contract only heal a limited quantity of flesh at a time? Either way, while the Easkli was steady on his feet he had chewed up limbs and his spear needed 2 arms to use. No wonder he was keeping a careful eye on Zenzel. Miriam was next out of the hole in the wall that Mayor Crespin had meant to be in Tupac's head. With such a keen eye for popular policies, it was no wonder the devil had been elected mayor, and she coughed from the smoke as he helped her into the street. She'd gotten a bad knock on the head when the devil was tossed into the firing line that Tristan had been a nominal participant in, but her eyes no longer seemed as dazed. She nodded her thanks. "Your leg," she rasped out. "Good enough to walk," Tristan said. He'd got a bad roll of the dice when he pulled on his contract to force Cosmo Flora to get stuck on their side of the inferno. A chunk of collapsing ceiling had hit the man's feet, which had flavored his backlash. The spray of wooden shards from a splintering board had hit mostly flesh, but he'd still had to tie cloth around his leg just above the knee to prevent his trousers being soaked in blood. They had not moved far from the hole in the wall, so when the last of them squeezed through he overheard the talk. "My thanks for the help," Cosm panted out, patting his clothes into order. He'd lost his musket during the chaos, by the looks of it. "If you had not tugged me back, that chunk of ceiling would have caught my head." Tristan winced, which the older man took as sympathy, but was in truth over the prospect of how vicious his contract backlash would have been over that. The thief nodded back at Cosm, too on the edge to feign deeper companionship. "We need to move," Zenzel Duma cut in, voice tense. "I do not see Lady Angharad or the others, which means we make our own way out," Tupac cut in with a drawl. Obviously. It seemed such a petty, pointless offense that Tristan was tempted to dismiss it as Tupac being habitually unpleasant. But the watchfulness of the Easkli's eyes revealed it to be a lie. A test, Tristan decided. He's prodding Zenzel to see how close the man is to drawing on him. By how the Milani's hand tightened around the grip of his sword, the answer was very close indeed. "The postern gate is on the west side of town," Tristan said. The most direct route takes us through a street just short of the town square, however, so I would suggest cutting across town and circling around the north instead. A longer trip will be more dangerous, Cosmo said. There was crashing sound to their side as another chunk of ceiling collapsed inside the last rest, prompting a furious scream from the mayor and panicked shouting from the cultists still contesting the legitimacy of his election. Mariam cleared her throat. Let's argue further away from that, she croaked out, pointing at the mess. Sound advice, which they all took. Heeding the thief's suggestion of cutting east across town instead of keeping west, where the alleys often turned into dead ends meeting the palisade, the five of them fled. Tupac took the lead, likely as much to keep his distance from the others as because he preferred the vanguard, and while Mariam kept Cosmo distracted, Tristan drifted towards the back. Before he could so much as speak a word, Lord Zenzel Duma frowned down at him. "You're a headache, did you know?" Zenzel said. "Half the people I speak to think you are a champion in the making, the other half that you are a feckless poison." Tristan cocked an eyebrow. Not even a poisoner, which admittedly he was, but poison outright. A bold claim. "And you?" he asked. "I am uncertain," Zenzel grunted. "Which is disconcerting for more reasons than you know." "Oh." That smelled of a contract, a morsel he might have liked to nibble at in other circumstances. Unfortunately, he must keep to greater concerns. "I am a rat, that is all," Tristan shrugged. "But, it seems to me, a rat who might share some interests with you." Bait had been set out but Zenzel Duma did not bite it. Instead the Milani noble kept silent, eyes flicking back and forth across thin air as if parsing out the invisible. "Eniloman, what is it that makes you want to kill Cosmo Flor so very badly?" Zenzel suddenly asked. Tristan stilled. He had been excruciatingly careful never to be outwardly hostile to the man. Even when he had spoken against Cosmo during the discussion in the town square, it had been as part of several, and Young's broadsides at him afterwards should have distracted most from remembering that besides. Even now, approaching the Milani, he had not given a name. And Tupac is the one who tried to get me killed for John's death, so he should be the first guess. This was the work of a pact, and the thought that one might allow Zenzel Duma to see through his every facade was uncomfortable. Like learning your shirt had been split open at the back the whole time. "Guesswork," Tristan said, forcing his tone to be dismissive. But he had hesitated for a second too long, he already knew, and Zenzel rolled his eyes. "You want to use me," the noble stated. "Send me after Tupac while you go for him so he cannot intervene." That was an unpleasantly accurate read of his intentions. Tristan swallowed, looking for anything at all on the man's face he could use but finding no purchase. Zenzel Duma's grief had been open, his hatreds were known and his recent friendships were obvious, yet the thief found through these nothing at all to move him. The thief looked away, deeply unsettled. Everything he had learned, been taught, told him that Zenzel Dum should be easy to leverage. Instead he was finding that the man's forthrightness had whittled away every grip, leaving him too slippery to move. "I owe him a debt," Tristan reluctantly said. "The bloody kind." Zenzel considered that. "As a servant of the Cheriton or on his own account?" "Oh, very much his," Tristan murmured. Zenzel grunted. "You do not strike me as man to whom hate comes easy," the Milani said, rolling a shoulder. "I will presume it was earned." He spat to the side, into the mud of the street. "I want Sarah's help," he said. Wounded or not, he might well kill me otherwise. Practical of the man. "She is no fighter even with signs," he warned. "But a distraction can be arranged." The noble looked like he wanted to push for more, but Tristan was only willing to promise so much and it must have shown on his face. There were other ways to line up his knife with Cosmo Flor's back. This was simply the most expedient. "Fine," Zenzel said. "Signal me when the time comes." Tristan nodded back. However tense the conversation, he found that in practice they had barely spent half a street quietly speaking. Tupac had them turning a corner short 2 streets short of the piled lumber hiding the jail, to head straight north as the thief had earlier suggested, and no one cared to contest any longer. It was there they first ran into more than the distant sound of musket shots, A dozen slaves, bearing makeshift clubs and field tools, filled the street before them. They turned, faces alarmed, and before anyone could so much as raise a weapon, Tupac stepped forward. He lowered his spear, saying something in the same cant he had used earlier, and it gave the Hollows pause. Their leader, a gray-haired woman with broad shoulders, asked something harshly. Tupac shrugged, replying, and there were a few more terse exchanges before the Hollows began to make room for them to pass through the street. "Tupac," the thief asked. "I made it known we have fought devils as well," the Eastly said. "That earned us some goodwill. They will let us cross." Cosm asked. "So they said," Tupac cheerfully said. "Though I would keep my weapons in hand, were I you." The Hollows seemed as wary of them as the other way around, both sides eyeing each other until their group of 5 had passed the former slaves. The 5 of them hurried once they were clear, the Hollows watching them go. Tupac gestured for them to slow as soon as they had turned a corner. "They also let us pass because they are heading for the battle," the Eastly said. "Their captain seems to believe that the Red Eye cult is winning." "Slaves and savages against a pack of devils?" Cosm skeptically said. "It will be a massacre even with the numbers on their side." "There are still sounds of fighting in the distance," Mariam pointed out. "Something must be evening the scales for there to be no clear victor. We saw the war band that is now attacking Kentika when we made our way here," Tristan slowly said. "They had a priestess with them, a woman the other cultists seemed to fear." "Pacts with old gods are dangerous things," Tupac said, tone unusually serious. "That which has no restraint and price yields none in power." That last sentence had sounded oddly cadenced, likely a quote. They began moving north again, skirting the edge of town to get around the fighting in the middle, but soon ran into cultists against. One cultist, more specifically, marked with ritual scarification from head to toe and trying to harangue a group of cowering slaves hiding out in the garden behind a house into joining their way. He turned his anger and his spear their way, shouting in some cant, but whatever he might have been about to say was cut short. Cosm shot him in the gut without missing a beat. He blew the smoke off his pistol's barrel as the slaves screamed in fear, some scattering while others flattened themselves behind rows of cabbage. "That should have been blade work," Tupac tightly said. "Someone will have heard you." "There are shots all over town," Cosm dismissed. "But not from here," Tristan said. "Let us pick up the pace before someone thinks to question that." He slid by Mariam as their strides quickened. She cocked an eyebrow his way and he wasted no time quietly filling her in on the bargain with Zenzel. She grimaced. "I will not use a sign on Tupac," she murmured. "It is too dangerous." He did not hide his surprise. She had not mentioned him to be dangerous in that regard before. "That spear of his," Mariam said, "I saw it go right through a devil's carapace. I think the head is Candlesteel." "I have never heard of it," Tristan admitted. "Eastly will not reveal how they make it," she said, "but supposedly it has something to do with their infamous candles. The material is death on ether, even the solid kind devils are made of, and it's only marginally kinder to Glom, so no signs anywhere near him." Considering Leander Galatas had exploded his own arm when a sign of his broke back on the blue belt, that seemed wise. "Any kind of distraction will do," he whispered. A moment of hesitation, then she nodded. "I will not be sticking around," Mariam informed him. "The moment they fight, I run." "I expected no less," he said. Besides, in the distance there was a burst of fire and light as a burning house collapsed, stopping them in their tracks as the brightness revealed a slice of nightmare near the town square. Screaming devils twined in red string were fighting against others of their kind, while scarred cultists in a phalanx kept away more of the creatures from their wildly laughing priestess, whose hands seemed to direct the puppeteered devils. Steel and powder faced a tide of claws and ripped shells, more hollows with makeshift weapons streaming from all sides to throw themselves into the fight. "You might have been right about taking the long way around," Cosm conceded into the silence. "Kind of you to say," Tristan replied. But let us. For the second time in less than a minute he was interrupted, again by the collapse of a house near the town square. Only that one had not been on fire a moment ago. With a faint whistling sound a second shell fell down, striking the melee at the heart of the town. The impact flattened a devil and turned 3 men to pulp. Far to the north the night filled with light as the watch's cannons began raining down fire on Kentucky. Why would they? Tristan began to think, but before he finished the question he already had the answer. Miriam had told him that in Three Pines the watch has some kind of antediluvian wonder that could see things afar. Of course they had used it after the collapse of the mountain, and used it on Kentucky in particular. It was where survivors would be heading. They must already know that the devils broke the terms and that the town was being conquered by the cult of the Red Maw. The devils had been right, in a way. The watch had written off the trial for this year. Only they'd been written off with it. "We need to get out of this cursed town right now," Cosm hissed. "Everyone will be rushing to the postern gate now," Tupac calmly noted. "It is closest to the town square." Meaning going that way was certain death. And looming trouble for Angerade's crew, if they used that side of the town to circle north towards the meeting point. Which he thought most likely, since the other group would be expecting them to leave through that same gate. That might well turn into a disaster, the thief thought, but it was not one he could do anything about. "Straight to the front gate," Tristan said. The world went bright. It was a heartbeat before Tristan realized he was on the ground, his ears ringing. The house ahead of him was a shattered, burning wreck and he threw up on the ground. He could barely focus his eyes as he crawled away, limbs trembling. Had he dropped something? His bag was still on his back, but he saw silhouettes moving, someone helping him up. Miriam, he saw, looking worried. "Army?" she was asking. "Tristan?" "Yeah," he croaked. "That's me." "You were lucky," she said. "If that had hit 10 feet to the right, you would be pulp." "Lucky," he repeated, rasping out a laugh. The others were. Tupac was on his knees but pushing himself up. Cosm seemed fine, though he was looking strangely at Zenzel who had his sword in hand as he moved behind the Eastly. "That," Zenzel Duma coldly said, "will do." He rammed the blade into Tupac's back, but the pale-eyed man twisted at the last moment. It was a wound, not a kill, and with a laugh the Eastly swatted Zenzel's leg. They fell, wrestling. A curse, and Tristan watched with wide eyes as Cosm floor bolted. He cursed in turn, pushing himself off Miriam, and his eye caught a glint of light on metal. His pistol lay where he'd fallen, flames reflecting off it. Young's pistol, the last piece of the bridge had burned. Cosm was getting away, every breath furthering the distance. His stomach clenched. Tristan looked at Miriam, found those blue eyes on him, and swallowed. "Go," she said. "Finish it. I will collect if we live." He licked his lips. "You know where I'll be," he said. And off he ran after Cosm, snatching Zenzel's abandoned lantern as he went. He ran through the nightmare, pursuing an older one. Smoke and fire and screams, Cosm Flora's silhouette just far enough ahead. With every breath he suffered the fear of losing him. The man was heading straight for the front gate, in as clean a line as he could, but the thief knew it would not work. Both devils and cultists would be heading for the postern to the west, but once one side had the clear advantage of that skirmish the losing one would be headed to the other way out. To Tristan's surprise, it proved to be the devils that lost out. Cosm hastily stopped and slid behind a couple of barrels come loose from a pile as a pair of devils still in their corpses came running out of a larger street, bickering in Antigua as they ran for the front gate. Tristan saw the grimace on the older man's face even before he slid down by his side. Cosm stiffened, hand reaching for his blade, but Tristan lay a finger on his lips. The older man bit the inside of his cheek, remembering that evils had uncanny hearing, and conceded with a curt nod. They waited until the devils were out of sight. "Why did you follow me, rat?" Cosm bit out when he finally felt safe. A shell hit a few blocks to the east, both of them flinching as a house shattered. "You think I want to be in the middle of that brawl?" Tristan replied. "I want out of this town place, a floor." "Find your own way," Cosm grunted. "My way was the front gate, same as you," Tristan replied, sounding impatient. "Only it won't work, will it? It'll be full of devils with the same bloody idea." Another shell fell, further away. They still tensed at the sound. Tristan licked his lips, made himself look nervous. "Look, I might know a place to hide out away from the bombardment," he said. "Found it with Xickle and Tredigger." The mustachioed man stared at him. "The underground jail," he said. "The one where you found the slaves." Tristan nodded. "It should be empty now," he said. "The cultists would have hit it first. Those prisoners were sure recruits." Cosme slowly nodded, face never wavering, and a heartbeat later Tristan had a knife at his throat. Gods, he'd not even seen the other man unsheathing it. Groggy as he was from the shell earlier, that was sloppy of him. "Why?" Cosme asked suspiciously. "Why run after me to share this and not simply go yourself?" Tristan bit his lip, made himself look aside. "Look how embarrassed I am," he thought. "Because I can't defend the place," he said, feigning bitterness. "If cultists go there, or a devil, they will trounce you," the older man finished, sounding thoughtful. "And the foreign girl's near as useless, it's true, so she was not worth bringing along." A shell hit something a few blocks over, screams sounding out. Cosme took away the knife. "All right," he said. "Lead me to the jail, Tristan." The place stank of mud and filth, but that was only to be expected. It was large enough that the two of them could have a few feet between them, and through the open hatch half covered by wood they could see the bombardment still lighting up the night. Until the watch was done hammering away at Kentica, it would have been madness to leave their hiding place. Miriam should be headed this way as well, soon enough, so Tristan must end it before then. He did not want his friend in the middle of this. The bare stone room they sat in was about 10 feet long and 10 feet wide, a rough square, and there was nothing inside save for the open door leading into the deeper jail full of shit and straw. Tristan had Zenzel's lantern at his side, almost entirely shuttered so it could not draw attention. Cosme still had his sword and knife, but no longer his musket, and his pistol had not been loaded since he'd killed a cultist with it. Tristan himself was down to his blackjack and knife. He did have needles in his bag, but a subtle blow with them would be nigh impossible in a place like this. Cosme Flora was a fit man with 2 inches on Tristan, and though in his 50s the soldier was a hardened killer grown long in the tooth doing the dirty work of House Cherden, in a straight fight Tristan would lose, and what could there be but a straight fight in a room of bare stone? Fortunately, Tristan still had the last of Abuela's gift. 2 vials, bearded cat extract and medical turpentine. He palmed this vial of bearded cat extract and quietly uncorked it, dripping the liquid into the shuttered lantern. The entire dose went in there, enough to drive a dozen men mad for an hour, but it would barely be enough for what he needed. The dose he could deliver by a needle or a knife would be too slow to act, but Alvareno's dosages was full of interesting notes about the substances it recommended for a poison box. Like, for example, that when left near a source of heat for the correct amount of time bearded cat tincture turned into a kind of volatile smoke very sensitive to temperature. Tristan discreetly got rid of the empty vial and waited for Cosme to be looking up through the hatch to take off his tricorn. The other hand he kept on the lever that moved the shutters. "Cosme," he whispered. The moment his enemy turned, he pulled the lever. The shutters opened, and with the difference in temperature, hot in, cold out, white smoke came billowing out furiously. Tristan covered his face with his tricorn, throwing himself back, but still felt smoke lick at his skin in the few heartbeats before it dispersed. His skin grew red and welted wherever it was touched, the sensation deeply unpleasant. It was probably why Cosme Flora was screaming, as it had gone right into his eyes. Most of the mind-altering properties were lost when the extract was made into smoke. It caused barely a tingling sensation, instead of hallucinations and violent bouts of emotion, but it did become significantly more acid. Tossing aside his hat, Tristan found Cosme clutching at his eyes and palmed his blackjack, coming closer to aim a blow. The man moved, though, and what should have been a hard strike on the side of the head instead caught his shoulder. Cosme reacted swiftly, grabbing his wrist and yanking Tristan forward. Keeping silent save for grunt of efforts, the thief wrestled with the old killer. An elbow hit his chin and he hissed in pain, striking at the flesh onto Cosme's ribs in retaliation, but then the mustachioed man headbutted him. Vision swimming, Tristan rolled away only to hear the sound of a knife leaving the sheath. He kept rolling, Cosm blindly stabbing at the ground where he had just been, and grit his teeth. He'd heard Cosm beat a god in a knife fight, out in the maze. Even with the other man blind, he doubted he would win. "I knew there was something off about, you little shit," Cosm snarled. "Who was it that hired you, the Ruesta?" Tristan drew further back and held his breath, but he knew that would not last long. The older man's eyes were closed and cringing, but he might still be able to see some and the pain would pass. His gaze swept the room, finding it bare save for one thing. Swallowing, he bet on a gamble. Tristan threw his blackjack against the wall to Cosm's left, and while the man struck blindly there darted to right, where he snatched up the lantern, swinging the massive forged iron Cosm's head even as the man turned back his way. It caught him right in the cheekbone, crunching most satisfyingly as Cosm's floor dropped to the ground. Oil went spilling, aflame, but hit only stone. It would keep. Tristan dropped the lantern, just carefully enough it wouldn't spill, and kicked the knife out of Cosm's hand as the man lay moaning on the ground. He kicked the man in the stomach, making him curl, and took his sword out of the sheath before tossing into the other room. In the distance, the fires of the Blastcloak artillery burned. Tristan went about it methodically. Boot coming down, he broke the right knee, the older man screaming hoarsely. Then he broke the left arm, at the elbow. That should be enough to prevent Cosm overpowering him. Finally bearing his own knife, he sat on the man's chest and rested the blade against his throat. "Fool," Cosm croaked. "The bitch is dead. Do you really think the Ruesta will still pay you?" "I have no agreement with House Ruesta," Tristan said. "Our business, Cosm Floor, is much older than that." The man blinked, eyes red and tearing. "Who are you?" Cosm rasped. "My name," he coldly said, "is Tristan the Brascal." It had been years, more than a decade, but still the old killer remembered. It barely took him a moment. Tristan might have cut him, if not for that. "The violinist," Cosm said. "Tomasa Brascal, gods. You're the son. I am the boy who was hiding under a table when you put a bullet in his father's head," Tristan told him. He'd been so strange, those last few weeks. Mother kept crying and I worried, thought he might sick. So I followed him, thinking as children do that I would protect him. Cosm rasped out a laugh. "Mayonnaise," he said. "He was close to losing it, so we brought him in through the trap door. There weren't any guards in that house. You saw that fucking slaughterhouse, didn't you?" If Tristan lived to be 500 years, he would not forget what he had seen down there. Children in pieces, strapped to stables and hooked to copper wires. Barrels of limbs, pools of blood. Men with more parts sewn on than not, and that thing held up in the air by golden chains so no part of it could touch the ground. "I told them a second entrance was a terrible idea," Cosm said, but Sferin insisted. "We couldn't keep bringing people in through the warehouse. People would ask questions." "Theogony," Tristan said. "That's what you four called it, when you had your little talk. What were you doing down there, Cosm? What was it all for?" "I don't know, kid," Cosm tiredly said. "I just ran the guards. Charette was the one with the grand plans. They put me in charge of finding mercfolk who already had contract, then Lord Laurent introduced them to the almsgiver." Tristan stilled, for at long last he had the fifth name on his list. The name of the god that had its filthy hands all over this butchery, that had contracted with his father knowing it would kill him. "The god that gave out the contracts, this almsgiver," he said. "Was it a Maine, Cosm?" "I don't know," Cosm replied, too quickly. "Tell me, the thief hissed. The older man laughed, only laughing harder when Tristan pressed his knife harshly against his throat. "You're going to kill me anyway, a Brascal," Cosm said. "Your threats mean nothing." Tristan slashed through his eyes, the man screaming and struggling. Cosm was stronger, but blind and in pain. It was not a straight fight. "Pain always means something, Cosm," Tristan replied. "Tell me." "I don't fucking know, kid," the older man rasped. "I was just round the guards." Whether that was true or not he could not tell, but he sensed he would get no more out of Cosm. A dead end, but he was not yet out of questions. "You were there when they closed it down," Tristan said. "Moved out. Where did they go, Cosme? Where are they butchering children now?" "Somewhere out in the Tribbean Sea," Cosme laughed. "I never asked. Never cared. I'd paid my dues, I was on the rise." "Not for long," Tristan thinly smiled. "Else he would not have been sent to the dominion of lost things, risking life and limb for favor." "Never for long," the man said. "That's the way, isn't it?" The thief's lips thinned. "Do you even regret any of it?" he asked. Cosme snorted. "I lived like a lord for years," he said. "Rich, respected. I might even have married into a good family, if I hadn't got cocky at the end. Regrets, a rascal." He was laughing. "You think you're the only one with mud on your shoes, rat? Regrets, gods." The blinded man offered a red, ruinous smile. "The hungry bite," Cosme Fleur rasped. "The beggared snatch." The cornered Tristan twisted, cut his throat before he could finish the words. He watched the man gurgle, blood spill out, and said not a word as his father's executioner died. Father, he had been half mad at the end. One eye gone yellow, a leg growing warped. It had been a mercy in some way, what Cosme did, and for that Tristan did not make his death slow. But he did not make it quick either. And only when the gurgling ended, when Cosme went still and his began to stiffen, did he finally tear his eyes away. 3, Tristan softly counted. May his father be spun smiling by the circle into his next life. He sat by the corpse, silent, waiting for Mariam to join him, perhaps with Zenzel, if the man still lived. And when he closed his eyes, when he thought of the sound of that trigger being pulled and father's brains splattering the floor mere inches away from his little feet, of the way he had bit his lip until it bled so he'd not make a sound, the scales felt slightly closer to even. "Laurent Sheridan," he whispered into the dark. "Florian Attiret. Spheren." All old names, worn from the speaking. And now there was one more to add. "The almsgiver," he tried out. It sounded, Tristan thought, like a promise. Tope continued. "Thanks for listening.